It's on. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to make a start. Firstly, thank you so much, Civil History Group, for inviting me to your annual general meeting, but actually, from my perspective, to hear our illustrious speakers today. It's my pleasure to chair. We are going to spend about an hour, roughly speaking, 15 to 20 minutes each for the speakers, and announcements by Duncan, but then time for questions and answers at the end. I used to be a teacher. I can be very strict with short questions. I'm just telling you that now. But I was very interested in the theme of today, which in my head I've had "We Need a Hero," the song, in my head all day, and the great forgotten liberal heroes. So we've got with us Professor Thomas Ottey and John Campbell, OBE. I'll introduce them very quickly and then get quickly to them telling us what they know, which will not fit into 15 to 20 minutes, I can assure. So Thomas is Professor of Diplomatic History at the University of East Anglia, where he teaches the history of modern war and conflict, military intervention and diplomacy, and British and European history of the 19th century. He is the author of some 21 books, including Statesmen of Europe, A Life of Sir Edward Grey, which was published in 2020, and he'll be telling us about him. Something from the blurb that we were all sent to advertise the meeting was that he was the longest serving foreign secretary. My goodness, how times have changed, have they not, ladies and gentlemen? And after about 20 minutes, we'll move to John Campbell, OBE, who's the co-founder of Campbell-Lutyens, an international private equity and infrastructure advisory house. He holds an MA in economics from Cambridge, where he was exhibitioner at Sydney Sussex College. He is the author of Haldane, the forgotten statesman who shaped modern Britain. And given that I had no idea who this person was, I'm genuinely interested to hear more. So I will start by inviting Thomas to his remarks. Thank you so much. Thomas Ottey, everyone.
Right. Right, thank you very much for the kind invitation and your very kind introduction, Leila. Now, I have to say, when I walked out Whitehall this evening, I was sort of wondering what Edward Grey would make of the proceedings this evening. And of course, you know, well, I've written his life now, but I don't know what he would have made of it. But I'm fairly certain he would have cocked a very quizzical eyebrow at the idea of him being treated as a hero. And also, I think he would have been delighted at sharing the platform with Richard Burdon Haldane, because Haldane was one of really only two people in politics who were not only close political associates of Edward Grey's, but also very close personal friends. And the friendship with Haldane, of course, we will hear probably more about that later on, started in the 1880s and it lasted until Haldane's death in 1928, wasn't it? Yes, good, well remembered. Now, also, as I was putting together my thoughts and notes for this evening, I thought, well, hero, exactly am I supposed to make of that? I must admit, the song didn't occur to me. I did something even naughtier. It's what I often do when I'm completely stuck. I go back to my old Liddell and Scott English-Greek dictionary, and I looked up heros. And so I found protector and defender. I'm also told that in Homer, it was not restricted to warriors alone, but applied to all free men. I thought that's more like it. The poet Pindar represents heroes as demigods and local deities or patrons. I'm not sure that's really appropriate here. But above all, there seems to be a connection with courage and with strength and an assumption that one has to take on fate and destiny. I'm just letting that hang there for a moment. And I will say a few things about Edward Grey, and then hopefully I can return to this whole issue of heroes. So there's more to Edward Grey than the famous quote that is attributed to him: "The lamps are going out all over Europe, and we shall not see them lighted again in our lifetime." Now, the market in political reputations, of course, is volatile. But in Edward Grey's case, it seems to me that it has been rigged. And it has been rigged probably by your local deity, David Lloyd George, who completely panned Edward Grey, one of his actually close associates for a very long period of time throughout their career. He panned him for having essentially now, there's something, one of Grey's contemporaries observed that there was something of the Sphinx about him. Why don't you spend some things and I'll just...
It's all right, somebody wasn't muted.
Ah, okay.
Sorted
We
it.
sorted, right.
Sorted.
The number of times they ask.
I usually rely on brute force, but
You
if you
did.
want to, maybe if you want to rely
Virtual
on
brute force.
if you want to rely on technology, that's fine with me. So anyway, a contemporary of Grey's observed once that there was something of the Sphinx about Edward Grey, and of course, if the Sphinx remains silent, then others will speak for her and project a certain image on the Sphinx. And I think that's been the case with Edward Grey. Grey had a very long political career. He was not only the longest serving foreign secretary since Castlereagh, and since then, the intervals get shorter and shorter these days, but so he was there for 11 years, exactly. Mine is a couple of hours, I think. But he was more than that. He was central to the inner workings of the Liberal Party from really the mid-1890s onwards until the early 1930s. And of course, during the last Liberal government, he was the irreplaceable Foreign Secretary, and again, central to how that government operated. He was the MP for Berwick, which was not a safe seat. It's gone the other way again. It still isn't. No, it's gone the other way again. But he held that seat, which is actually it was a Tory seat, and he took it and he held it for I think 31 years, something like that. Yes, 31 years, and he increased his majority at almost each of the elections, often against the national trend. And altogether, he was involved in politics for 48 years across 3 reigns. So it's quite a substantial record. And indeed, there were some who wanted Edward Grey to become leader or later prime minister, but not he. He always declined for various reasons. But Grey was also a very significant figure in domestic politics. He started off as a radical young reformer when he entered Parliament in 1885. But mostly he is associated with the Liberal imperialists. Now, empire, of course, it's a rather tricky word these days. It conjures up all kinds of images. I invite you to try and understand it in the context of the 1890s, the early 1900s. Empire is something that this country has acquired. Empire is something of a burden, but empire is also possibly a vehicle for major reforms. And that's the Liberal imperialists. So they embrace the need for reform, they embrace the need to make this country more efficient and capable to compete with other nations abroad, Germany, but also the United States in particular. And it's really democracy and empire. These are the 2 motivations for Edward Grey throughout his career. He was, like so many of his time, he entered politics out of a patrician sense of duty. But he was also convinced that it was his job and the job of his class, if you like, to smooth the path for the working classes and the middle classes who are now gradually entering parliament. He regarded the aristocracy as a dying class, and that in a sense also held him back. That is one of the reasons why he never wanted to become leader. Now, when you look at his domestic outlook, I think Arthur Balfour, the Tory leader and Prime Minister, had it about right. He said Edward Grey was a curious mixture of the old-fashioned Whig and the socialist. So that placed him very neatly in the spectrum of new liberalism. So a reform movement within the Liberal Party that embraced the capacity of the state to introduce social reforms and to ameliorate many of the social ills which afflicted Edwardian Britain. And Grey had a pretty sharp perception of these. He was a strong supporter right from the beginning, 1885, when this was not very popular, not in the Liberal Party, not with Liberal leaders, and even less so with their wives. He was a strong supporter of the rights of women to vote. And this goes all the way through his career. He's in favor of payment for MPs. He advanced educational and constitutional reforms, and he hoped to address the grievances of Ireland and Wales and Scotland through some form of devolution. So all of these are live issues still today, profound challenges to Britain's social and political cohesion and economic prosperity, and indeed her international standing. Now, Grey had very strong views about all these things, but he was essentially a pragmatist. So purity of principle held no attraction for him. Ideas had to be put into practice, and reformers had to demonstrate governing competence to earn the right to a seat in government, to be able to change the country for better. But he was not unprincipled. I think that's very important. He was a moderate, but moderation need be no vice, it seems to be. But it demands substantial political figures who are capable of inspiring confidence. And Grey inspired that confidence because of his character, people always comment on, and his dignified simplicity. But he would fight for the things that he believed in and that he thought were right. So there was nothing of the greased piglet about Edward Grey. He was no ruthless opportunist, if you like, but he accepted the facts. He accepted that you had to deal with them in order to overcome them and change them, if you like. And that applied also, perhaps even more so, to Grey's stewardship of foreign policy. He was, as I said earlier, the longest serving, continually serving Foreign Secretary since Castlereagh. In his stewardship of foreign affairs, I think he showed a certain cautious instinct that was paired with a shrewdness of perception. He was much more widely traveled and spoke much better French than contemporaries and later historians have suggested. But he was free from that peculiarly British, or perhaps I should say English, affliction, which is to assume that we can tell other countries what they need to do, and that it somehow behoves other countries to heed our advice. So he accepted that Britain was one of 5 great powers, and you have to work with those 5 great powers in order to get anywhere. And much of the criticism that has been leveled at Edward Grey's handling of foreign affairs, it seems to me, is in essence either a modern version of Little Englanderism, we've got nothing to do with these people, let them go to war if they want to, or it's a sort of an inverted form of imperial psychosis. Now, in order to understand his foreign policy, one really has to focus on one key aspect, and that is the international situation as it presented itself in around 1905, when Grey comes to office. And I'm now going to do what politicians always do. I'm going to strip away all the nuances, all the context, and I'm going to boil it down to the bare essence of what I consider the key fact. The key fact is that between 1905 and around 1912-13, there is no functioning balance of power in Europe because Russia is weak. Until 1905, until 1945, the Russo-Japanese War, there is a functioning balance of power in Europe because there are two competing power blocks, the Franco-Russian alliance and the German-Austrian-Italian Triple Alliance, and they balance each other out. Britain can hold aloof and do its own thing, and pretend to uphold the balance of power. But the Europeans can do that for themselves pretty effectively. But this is no longer the case after 1905. The entirety of the Russian Navy sits at the bottom of the Korean Straits. Russia's finances are in a complete mess, and it will take years to work out how to improve Russia economically. And the Russian army is needed to maintain order inside Russia because there is a revolution in 1905. So the Franco-Russian alliance isn't working. Germany has much more elbow room, if you like. And of course, she did push her weight around. So what does all of that mean for Britain? It means Britain needs to be much more actively engaged in Europe if she wants to preserve the status quo on the continent. And that means tacking much more closely to France during many of the crises that now occurred on the continent. But Russia's weakness also gave Britain the opportunity to settle outstanding imperial conflicts with Russia in Central Asia, hence the 1907 Anglo-Russian agreement. But the key point here is Grey was not ententiste, if you like, at all costs. He resisted French pressure to enter into a fully fledged alliance. He did not give in to Russian blackmail during the various Balkan crises, 1908, 1912, 1913, in order to keep a free hand. Then there's the problem of Germany. There was a profound problem in that it was very difficult for British politicians accurately to read what the Germans wanted. A place in the south. Well, where is that? You ask the Germans, they couldn't actually tell you. They wanted to have a powerful fleet. Well, yes, okay, you can have a powerful fleet. We get involved in a naval race, and the British government, led by Grey, relied on deterrence, meeting the German naval challenge at sea, but also by offering compromises. We are ready to settle differences, just as we settled differences with the French or the Russians, in return for some broader understanding. And it very nearly worked, because by 1912, 13, 14, the situation is very different. Russia has regained in strength. The Franco-Russian alliance is much more effective again in European politics. Germany is in a much weaker position. She has effectively admitted that the naval race is lost. And in the Balkan crises of 1912-13, the two wars that very easily could have escalated and involved all the European powers, the Germans cooperate with Britain. And it's really Grey's achievement that there is no escalation in 1912 or 1913. He brings all the powers together in a conference and brings about a settlement. Perhaps he was a little over-flattered by the success of that of those conferences, and that may well have affected his handling of the July crisis in 1914. But certainly until then, until August 1914, he was, as the American ambassador Walter Hines Page said at the time, he was the preserver of Europe's peace. Now, Britain, of course, traditionally eschewed strategic thinking and tended to rely on ad hoc solutions to emerging crises. And that always meant that Grey had to rely on diplomacy and on the image of the impression of British financial and naval power in order to gain any kind of leverage. So that meant he couldn't enter into continental alliances. That meant also that the Liberal government could not entertain the idea of conscription, having a standing army. An illiberal defense policy was simply not practicable in liberal Britain. But what Grey did throughout the July crisis was to try to encourage a conference solution to this, to the Sarajevo murders. Warnings had been given aplenty to Berlin and to some extent to Vienna. They had been understood by the German ambassador in Berlin, Count Lichnowsky, Prince Lichnowsky, sorry. A truly tragic figure. He was not listened to by the people in Berlin. They ignored him. And so what Grey heard through the first phase of the July crisis was all the right things. Yes, Berlin wants to cooperate, but Berlin did its own thing. And once Vienna and then Berlin had decided on war, there was very little that the British could do. It's also very important to bear in mind that neither France nor Russia was willing to yield to Austro-German pressure in July 1914. They were prepared to let it come to war. And so there was no chance of actually having French or Russian cooperation for any kind of diplomatic solution. And the choice that then faced the British government was either we hold aloof, in which case the Europeans will sort this out amongst themselves, or we join in and then we have a say at the peace conference. And that was the choice that they took, and I think it was the right choice. There's one other aspect, briefly, of Grey's foreign policy, and that was his advocacy and his pursuit of schemes for settling international disputes by means of arbitration and sort of quasi-legal cooperation. That, of course, was in the tradition of 19th century liberalism, but he pursued it by means of bilateral treaties with, for instance, the United States, but also with Japan. And once the war had broken out in 1914, he pushed this even further, and Grey is arguably one of the intellectual fathers of the League of Nations. But he was very clever in the way he handled Woodrow Wilson and the Americans, and he then believes that actually it was Woodrow Wilson's idea, but actually it originated with Edward Grey. So it seems to me that Edward Grey's judgment remained sharp right until the very end. He was someone who actually warned of Hitler in April 1933. Compare that again with your hero David Lloyd George, who goes to Berchtesgaden in 1936 and calls Hitler the George Washington of Germany. Grey then was a pragmatist, but a principled one. He foresaw the catastrophe of war, and he warned of the catastrophe of this war for years before 1914. But in the end, he could not avert it. His arbitration schemes foreshadowed the later 20th century forms of international governments. He pursued social reforms to boost educational attainment and to enhance democratic participation and accountability. And he pursued an engaged foreign policy that embraced Britain's European and global role. Now, of course, he was a man of his own time, but it seems to me that he still speaks to some of the concerns of today. And I think there's something heroic in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was riveting.
So I have to go rather tenderly because my back gave way this morning. But if I suddenly wince, it's not a heart attack. It's just a suddenly stab going through me. You do me a great honour in inviting me to come and join the distinguished Presserati tonight. and you do Haldane the great honour, which is much, much more important. The subtitle of my book on Haldane, The Forgotten Statesman Who Shaped Modern Britain, is, I know, a bold statement. And I wanted 20 minutes or so to seek to convince you that statement is not merely my truth, in the fashionable terms, but it speaks to a collective truth. And more than that, I want to suggest that the application of Haldane's thinking and techniques today could marvelously enhance the shape of British national and international life. Why? Because fundamental thinking based on well-grounded principles are ever relevant. Indeed, the mantra Haldane infused into his generals at the War Office just across the road was that it costs nothing to think. The Times said on Haldane's death, he was one of the most powerful, subtle, and encyclopedic intellects ever devoted to the public service of his country. But what I found, and what really marks him out and makes him such a marvelous human being, was his inspiring personality, his personal attributes, his self-effacement, and a surprising boyishness and sense of fun. So who was he? The only public memorial to him in Great Britain is the mere blue plaque on the face of 28 Queen Anne's Gate, to which he moved after entering government in 1905. Grey moved at the same time to number 3 Queen Anne's Gate from their previous adjacent flats in Whitehall Court, a few yards along the road. Grey lived above Haldane. The plaque on number 28 reads, Lord Haldane, 1856 to 1928, statesman, lawyer, philosopher. The plaque should also read educational reformer. Haldane would have put philosopher first. He always said that philosophy was his first love. Born in Edinburgh, educated at the university there, he takes a term out at Göttingen in Germany, age 17. There he falls in love with Professor Lotz, his classroom becoming what he called his spiritual home, and where he's introduced the philosophy of Fichte. This brought Haldane on to his hero Hegel and to the development of British idealism. Unlike analytic philosophy, which fatally under Russell succeeded it, idealism is a practical philosophy, of which T.H. Green at Oxford was a key proponent, sending out his graduates to build a better world, building society from the bottom up, a Haldane passion. Haldane co-wrote and edited his first book on philosophy at the age of 27. He became a formidable philosophical thinker. He was actually offered the chair of moral philosophy at St Andrews, then, as it is today, one of the preeminent moral philosophy universities in 1904. There he delivered over 2 years, 1904 and 1905, just before going into government, his series of 20 Gifford lectures, 570 pages of philosophical reflection. It was the philosophical mind that brought him into the close relationship with the conservative A.J. Balfour, Arthur Balfour, that Press already talked about. Haldane was the true philosopher-statesman of Plato and of Aristotle. He actually became the president of the Aristotelian Society in 1907, a year and a half after becoming Minister for War. Then his profession as a lawyer. He comes to London on his father's death, age 21, to earn his living as a lawyer. He is called as a barrister, age 24. He specialized early on in cases heard before the highest courts of appeal in the country. He becomes a QC at 33, the youngest made up for 50 years. He reaches the pinnacle of his profession when entering government in 1905 as Secretary of State for War. Age 49, he was the highest paid barrister, earning the equivalent of £2 million today. After being elevated to the Lords in 1911 to steer through the most controversial Parliament bill, reforming the House of Lords itself, he becomes in 1912 the Lord Chancellor, until being thrown out on the formation of the coalition government in 1915, although he was to come back in the same role in 1924 in the first Labour government. As part of his Lord Chancellor's role, he both presided as a judge over the appeals to the House of Lords. He was also appointed president of the Judicial Appeals Committee of the Privy Council, the Supreme Court of the Empire, where he served as a judge of that court for a total period of 17 years until his death in 1928. It was there in the interplay of law and philosophy, and in a preeminent example of judicial activism, believing that judges had a duty to interpret the movement of the underlying general will, a great philosophical concept of society. He famously consolidated in his judgments his earlier work as an advocate and a QC in the great cause of restructuring the Canadian Constitution, through giving greater power to the provinces over the Dominion, bringing power always down, nearer to the people. Why is that important? Because I argue in my book, this posthumously, 67 years after his death, saved the integrity of Canada. That's what happens if you do the right thing. For in 1995, despite all those extra powers that Haldane gave to the provinces, which were fiercely opposed at the time over the Dominion, that led to, by the narrowest of margins, the Quebec referendum being lost in their attempt to secede from Canada by 50.6% to 49.4%. So, philosopher, lawyer, and now statesman. You might say this officially starts with his first ministerial appointment in December 1905, alongside Edward Grey as Secretary of State for War, for which he's most remembered. Over 7 years in that office, he totally reorganizes the structure of the army, which had proved so disastrously ineffective in the Boer War. He creates the fabled British Expeditionary Force. He creates the Territorial Army. He creates the officers' training course of the schools and universities so that you could scale the army quickly should war happen. He creates a special security branch, the predecessor of both MI5 and MI6. He sets up in 1912 the Royal Flying Corps, the forerunner of the RAF in 1918. He puts flesh on the bones of the skeleton of H.H.'s newly created General Staff, and he creates the Imperial General Staff, bringing the empire into coordinated common military purpose. He also devoted himself to the development of the planning role of Balfour's Committee of Imperial Defence, which he even chaired in Ramsay MacDonald's first Labour government. Altogether, it was a brilliant period of office, which was to earn for him Haig's wonderful post-war encomium, the greatest Secretary of State for War Britain has ever had, and Seeley, his successor at the War Office across the road, poignant accolade, he saved the state. Haldane's consistent underlying public service ambition was the promotion of the most effective structure of government and of the civil service. For he always thought out the great principles and policies. As early as 1880, he'd worked to form the 80 Club, named after Gladstone's second electoral victory that year, to develop and proselytize modern liberal thinking. In 1902, he was a founder with the Webbs of the coefficients to think through the cause of national efficiency. And then later in 1918, he was the chair of the celebrated Machinery of Government Committee into the administrative structure of an efficient post-war Britain. There, he advocated a deep ministerial and professional civil servant partnership, resting at the heart of effective administration. He promoted the education of civil servants and created and was the first president of the Royal Institute of Public Administration in 1921, which for 70 years was the go-to body for developing the theory and practice of public administration. He advocated a smaller working cabinet, which might have mitigated the power of today's presidential style PM, Prime Minister, and the growth of the power of special advisors. He recommended that ministries be split by function, not by beneficiaries. For example, he said we should have a Ministry of Health, which came into being a year after his report in 1919. He pushed to establish a proper cabinet secretariat, building on Hankey's work during the war for the War Cabinet, and for the employment and the promotion of women within the civil service, ever a great cause, as Tom Watty said. He created the modern structure of advisory councils, starting with the Department of Social and Industrial Research in 1916, and then set up the Medical Research Council in 1990. In 21, in helping to define the respective roles of the state and the private sector in public affairs, he gave his seminal evidence before the Cole Commission on the nature of effective nationalisation. He declared himself neutral on the political philosophy of nationalisation, but insisted that if the state were to own and operate the coal industry, then it had to have thoroughly qualified, technically trained civil servant businessmen to do the job properly. So as the plaque says, statesman, lawyer, philosopher, but I must squeeze in some reference to his work as an educational pioneer. The list of his achievements there is breathtaking. He first concentrated on the restructuring of London University as a teaching as well as examining body and bringing in the 1898 Act with Balfour's support from the opposition benches, which reformed London. His catalytic enablement of the study of both natural and social sciences, which he passionately believed in, exemplified in jointly creating with the Webbs the London School of Economics and Social Science in 1895. The Webbs insisted on his death that Haldane's portrait should hang alongside theirs in the founder's room, and the founding catalyst, the central motivating force of setting up Imperial College in 1907, the preeminent school today in natural sciences, as the London School of Economics, the preeminent school in the economic and social sciences. He was president and promoter of the charter of Birkbeck College as London University's working men's college. He founded and was the first president of the Institute of Adult Education. He was a fellow of the British Academy, he was a fellow of the Royal Society, but outside London, he catalyzes the whole concept of the red brick civic universities by the advocacy he gave to the Privy Council Committee in 1902, which sprang Liverpool free of the repressive structure of the three-city Victoria University, again, getting it down always to the nearest place you could do it efficiently. And that led to the creation of Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, and Bristol over the next 6 years as the first civic university alongside Birmingham. He advocates the change invited by Balfour in 1898, that at the time they're bringing the London University Act to bring the changes to the Irish universities, because the Irish said they would only vote in support of the London scheme if Haldane turned his attention to what was needed in Ireland. And it took the Liberal government in 1908 to finally implement his proposal and set up University College Dublin and Queen's University Belfast. He leads his Royal Commission on the Welsh universities in 1917 after standing down and being forced out of government on the coalition. He creates the University Grants Committee to allocate the government research grants. So by the way, before I move on from education, don't forget, every bit of that was done in his spare time. He never held government office in education. So as we celebrate our two statesmen this evening, let me touch upon the intimacy of the 40-year relationship between Grey and Haldane, and in so doing refer to the terrible injustice that was removed from government in 1915. Grey and Haldane became the MPs, as to what is said, in 1885 at the age of 23, Grey, 29, Haldane. And Haldane introduces his old legal friend, they'd worked together in the law, Asquith, 4 years his elder, he was 33 then, to his constituency in East Fife the following year, 1886, just across the Firth of Forth from Haldane's Haddingtonshire constituency and just north, as we say, of Grey's Berwick seat. Haldane choreographs a deep intimacy between those three men. They're the elite band at the heart of advancing a wider socially democratic role for the Liberal Party. Haldane believed actually that if only the Liberals would move faster, they could obviate the need to have a Labour Party at all. But Grey, a dedicated countryman, was ever ambivalent about political life. Haldane was privy to Grey and his wife Dorothy's deep disillusionment as early as 1890. Grey wrote to Haldane saying, I quote, "If it were not for you, I do not think I should have even the hold on public life which I have now." In 1893, Haldane writes to Dorothy saying, again, I quote, "that the one blow that I should feel a heavy and even crushing one would be that Edward should leave politics. For me, it would rob the outlook of much of its hope and meaning." Grey perseveres. In the autumn of 1905, in the Relucas Pact, Haldane, Grey and Asquith commit to each other not to enter government under Campbell-Bannerman unless Bannerman goes as the Prime Minister to the House of Lords, and they were given the key roles of Lord Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, and Chancellor of the Exchequer. In the end, Asquith buckled, but the nation-saving outcome of that was that Haldane took the War Office rather than became Lord Chancellor. 6 weeks after entering government, Dorothy Grey is thrown from her dog cart in Northumberland Lane. She dies a few days later. A week after her death, Grey returns to London, to the flat down the road, and asks Haldane if he can come down to his flat immediately above Haldane to live with him for the first time. Reading the daily letters to Haldane's mother, with fantastic correspondence in the National Library of Scotland, which talks about the closeness of the relationship and the devotion of the two men. That period crucially coincided with the baptism of fire for Grey at the Foreign Office. Germany and France were at loggerheads, and Morocco, over Morocco. And a request from the French ambassador comes through for clarification of Britain's response should Germany invade France that summer, as she was rumored to be planning, comes through to Grey. Grey immediately inquires of his friend Haldane, what could the army do if that was to happen? Haldane discovers that it would amount to a mere 80,000 men, and it would take 2 months to get them mobilized. Secretly, military discussions with the French were authorized by Grey and Haldane, with the consent of Campbell-Bannerman, but without the knowledge of the cabinet. This was later in 1911 to breed distrust by Haldane, distrust in Haldane by both colleagues and by the opposition. But by then, Haldane's reorganization of the British Army was largely complete. And at the outset of war, a force of double that, 160,000 men, was ready for mobilization in less than 1 month. The vital British Expeditionary Force made up of professional, non-conscripted soldiers, the glorious old contemptibles, that critically helped the French slow the advance and turn back the Germans from the gates of Paris at the Battle of the Marne. Prior to that, in 1912, in an attempt to head off the competition in naval construction that Tom Ottey talked about, of ever-increasing numbers of dreadnoughts being built by both Germany and by Britain, the Germans invited a British minister to visit Germany. It was Haldane, a fluent German speaker, very familiar with Germany, loved their literature, loved their technology, and obviously learned so much about the structure of their own war office from them, that Grey and Asquith in the cabinet agreed should go on an ad referendum basis to probe out the situation. He held 3 days intimate discussions with the Kaiser, the Chancellor, and Admiral Turks alone. But even after that visit became public knowledge, it was never officially commented on by the government, thus sowing a further seed of distrust of Haldane in Conservative Party and press circles, which in the febrile atmosphere of the war was to bubble over into Haldane's dismissal. Come the desperate post-Sarajevo period of diplomacy seeking to avoid war, Grey again turns to Haldane. A week before the outbreak, Grey actually comes to live at number 28 with Haldane and stays there for a total of 10 weeks. Grey's eyesight was deteriorating, and they were able to do their red boxes together and to consult intimately, both as political colleagues and, as Tom says, as personal friends. Haldane's sister Elizabeth records something of the atmosphere of that time. She was a formidable woman in her own right, a great civil servant, a great philosopher, a great linguist. She returned to London on the 6th of August, 2 days after the outbreak of war. She wrote, Sir E.G. was staying with Richard from the 27th of July, and he and Richard passed through a time of mental strain amounting to torture. Both strained for peace. For Richard, it was a personal sorrow of the greatest magnitude to come to war with a power like Germany. The country seemed divided, and 10 of the cabinet were against war and ready to resign. Then came the advance on Belgium, a friendly power, whose rights we were bound as one of her guarantors to respect. To E.G.'s mind, this settled matters. He went on Sunday, 2nd August, to Downing Street with R and Lord Crewe, the Liberal leader of the Lords, who had been dining at 28 Queen Anne's Gate. They found the Prime Minister and ladies playing bridge. Lord Crewe said it was like playing on the top of a coffin. They waited till they finished about an hour. Edmund Goss, the librarian of the House of Lords, an eminent literary scholar and deep friend of Haldane, fascinating man, wrote on the 3rd of August to Earl Spencer of that same day. It gives a marvelous picture of the feverish activity in Haldane's home. I quote, "What days these have been. Yesterday, Haldane telephoned for me to come and cheer him up in the interval between the cabinet meetings. At the door, Gray was showing Cambon, the French ambassador, out, such an aged and drawn and flushed Cambon. Gray was perfectly calm, but grave to solemnity. He told me the Germans had seized Luxembourg. I urged Haldane to lie down and rest, but he refused altogether, saying that talk was the only rest possible. They stayed on an hour and a half. Meanwhile, Gray took the motor and went off to the zoo to spend an hour among the birds. Was that not characteristic? At 6, Lichnowsky, the German ambassador, called for a few words with Haldane before the cabinet at 6:30, so I vanished down the back staircase. The poor French are in despair at what they take to be our irresolution. Perhaps they will find that we are not as irresolute as they think." But I've got to close. By his death, the unmerited innuendo which led to Haldane's prescription was accepted as a tragic example of xenophobic bigotry and a misguided press clamour at its worst. Nearly 1,000 letters poured in to Clone, his home in Scotland, to his sister Elizabeth, and obituaries and testimonials and editorials were devoted to him worldwide. Can you imagine a politician receiving today an accolade from a civil servant on the lines of the words of Selby Bigg, the permanent secretary of the Board of Education, which was echoed by a phalanx of other civil servants who wrote to Haldane's sister, I quote, "Of all the men in public life with whom I've worked, there's none for whom I had a greater respect and regard. A civil servant has uncommonly good opportunities for judging the qualities of ministers and men in high places, to whom they display all the features of their minds and character, consciously or unconsciously. Your brother was a man who knew how to do big business, both because he saw principles clearly and stuck to them. Naturally, he got his best work out of those he trusted, and he got loyalty. He was always open-minded and willing to listen and argue any point cooperatively. Or applauded from the opposition benches, such as the encomium of the Conservative leader of the House of Lords and Lord Privy Seal, the Marquess of Salisbury. Again, I quote, "He was a friend of many men and women who did not belong to his political way of thinking. Personally, I can speak with great knowledge, for I received the utmost consideration at his hands. In many departments of public life, he was altogether free from any party feeling. He was a great party man, of course, but beyond his party feelings, there was a large area of public life which he looked upon from an entirely impartial standpoint. and in which he was of the greatest assistance to any government, whatever its political complexion. All the letters are in the National Archive, hundreds and hundreds of them speak to the similar theme. Haldane bestrode his time. How did he do it, and on purpose? By incredibly hard work and focus, dedication to the public good, extraordinary personal skills, but I believe on the foundation of 5 key principles. First, always go back to first principles. Ask the key questions. What's the War Office for? Answer: to win wars. Therefore, judge every decision by that measure. Second, education, 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 school, university, lifetime, and dig deep in science and research and intelligent inquiry. Third, the level of decision-making is crucial. In Haldane's Hegelian infused state, you always take decisions as close as sufficiently possible to do to the people affected, whether in national or international affairs. Fourth, combine idealism with realism. Timing is everything. Take the long-term view, work to identify the general will, and incorporate that into your long-term planning. And fifth and last, be ever a statesman, which I define as someone who, in taking action today, however difficult, heads off the preventable evils of tomorrow, and in so doing, in the pursuit of principle, seeks wherever possible to maximize cross-party cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, John. I hope the audience have forgiven me for allowing that to go long, but I think it was well worth the extra minutes, and I thank you profusely. Duncan has a few things he needs.
This is just a brief commercial break before we get on to questions to the speakers. People online, we're beginning to get some questions in already, but if you want to put them in the chat, that would be useful. So just for those of you who aren't subscribers to the Journal of Liberal History, just a few words about what we are, who we are and what we do. The Liberal Democrat History Group was founded when this party was founded back in 1988. And our mission is to encourage discussion and research of the histories of the Liberal Democrats and our predecessor parties, the Liberal Party and the SDP. And we do this in 4 main ways. First is to organise meetings like this. Hope you've enjoyed it. The next meeting we're organising is a fringe meeting at Liberal Democrats Spring Conference in York, looking at the political career of Shirley Williams. It's the meeting we had planned to organise at the autumn conference that was cancelled. That's on the Friday evening of the Spring Conference starting at 8:15. Then we'll be hopefully back in the National Liberal Club, though it slightly depends on how much they're planning to charge us, for a meeting in July, looking at Vernon Bogdanall's new book, The Strange Survival of Liberal Britain. And we'll have Richard Toy as well, looking back at the George Dangerfield thesis, The Strange Death of Liberal England, which he wrote in the 1930s. So, you know, what's the relationship between the two? And we'll have another fringe meeting at the Liberal Democrat Autumn Conference, and so on. Second thing we do is publish the Journal of Liberal History. This is the issue that's just out, winter 2022-23. It covers a range of articles, book reviews, meeting reports, and other material. And you can subscribe via our website, which is the third thing we do. We maintain a website for research resources for students of liberal history at liberalhistory.org.uk. And you can also see there the fourth thing we do, which is a range of reference books and reference booklets, shorter booklets, as focusing on particular aspects of liberal history, liberal thinkers, liberal ideology, famous women liberals, and so on. So as I said, you can see all this at our website. Those of you who are at the AGM will note that we've increased the subscription rate, but that doesn't come in until September. So if you subscribe now, you'll still get us at the old rate, which is £25, either print or digital versions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Right, so we have already gone over, but given that we started a bit late, I think that's fine. What I'll start by doing is perhaps taking 3 questions from the floor, and feel free to address them either one or both speakers. I mean, given the relationship between the 2 men, I'm sure that both of you will have something to say. And then for a second round of questions, I might come to you, Duncan. So if you want to sort of highlight some So gentleman in the red scarf, and then I'll come to.
Could I put a question to Professor Haldane, please? In 1929, Gray's on record of saying, in relation to the outbreak of the war in 1914, and I quote, "I could have done more. I ought to have intervened earlier to warn Berlin of the consequences of their intended action. Bearing in mind the argument about the war was inevitable. Could Gray have done more? What could it have done? Would it make any difference?"
Thank you. A masterclass in brevity. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Could I ask our speakers to amplify upon Haldane's initiative in trying to seek peace talks? I think it was 1915, but halfway through, which he was being introduced, I think, very badly. It seems to me that's an area which hasn't been adequately explored generally by authors, and an opportunity to bring to act on, I think, was Prince Sixtus and Pope Benedict's initiatives that felt that time.
Thank you. And over there.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for the talks. And just to say, I haven't read the Grey book, but I very much enjoyed John Camp's book on judicial. I guess the question is to both of you, but perhaps a bit more for John. Richard Haldane was undoubtedly a liberal hero, but he ended his life in the Labour Party, and he was a great philosopher and Hegelian, but he didn't leave behind him much of a legacy of discussion of Labour history or socialism or anything of that kind. And I want to know why you think he joined the Labour Party. Was it purely pragmatism, great, improve, Asquith improve, or was there something deeper philosophically that he thought required? It's an interesting question for me to deal.
Thank you all three. So one for Tom, two for John.
All right, good. Okay. Could Edward Grey have done more? Well, that was a question that Edward Grey asked himself quite a lot after 1914, especially after 1960. What I think one really has to bear in mind is that when you actually look at his exchanges with especially the German ambassador, the question of war and Britain's attitude towards a continental war crept up continually. And in fact, there's a meeting between the two 4 days before the Sarajevo murder, in which they discuss war and a continental war. And Prince Lichnowsky, who was one of the tragic figures in this entire story, said to Grey, "I fully understand that if my government does something stupid and goes to war against France, you will have to support France. We understand this. I have reported this to Berlin. We know this. So, if that is your starting position when something goes wrong in the Balkans, and you call in the various ambassadors, as Grey does, very early on, when there's deafening silence coming from Vienna and the other capitals, and he says to the Russians, you have to give assurances to the Germans because they feel very nervous and they're fearful that something is planned against them. Give them assurances and I will support that. And he says to the Germans, give the Russians assurances that you will not exploit this crisis and I will support this and make the right noises. Then that seems to be fully in line with all the crisis diplomacy that's been going on since 1912 and 1913. And I think it's very understandable why Grey thought this is a realistic policy. What he didn't know, of course, was that the people in Berlin didn't trust Lichnowsky and they kept him in the dark. They didn't tell him what was going on. They didn't tell him that they had given the white check to the government in Vienna. They didn't tell him that Vienna wanted to go to war. Vienna is the only government that, Austria-Hungary, is the only government that actually wanted war, willed war in 1914, and the others were prepared to run the risk of war, to conjure up the spectre of war, to force the other side to back down. And it really took until the 24th of July, 25th of July for the British to work out that Lichnowsky had not been telling them the truth, not because he lied, but because he himself had not been told the truth. So it's a sort of tragic misunderstanding, I think. But I think it's, if you put it in the context of previous crises and context of what Grey knew and when he knew it in the course of the July crisis, and I think it's a perfectly rational policy to pursue, the policy that he tried to pursue. He always aimed to have a sort of concert of Europe style solution to this. And in fact, he offered the Germans, we look at the documents, he says to the Germans on the 26th or 27th of July, make a suggestion, I will back it, whatever it is, you know, I'm offering you any solution on a silver salver. Austrian occupation of Belgrade and heavy reparations and so on. He will accept it, and he will ensure that the French will accept it as well. What of course he doesn't know is that the French wouldn't support it because they're fearful of losing Russian support, and the Russians are also not prepared to give in. So is it inevitable? No, it's not inevitable, but it also always depends on what the other governments are saying to each other. And we're not allied to France, we're not allied to Russia. They don't tell us anything, and we have no means of controlling them. Because if Grey goes to the French and the Russians says, restrain yourself, moderate your behavior, they will come back and say, yes, of course, we're very happy to do that, but in return, you will enter a fully fledged, fully binding, mutually binding alliance with us. And then you're stuck. And then the next crisis that comes along, you can't get out of that, and you will go to war. So I think, in a sense, you can make the argument that his luck held for 10 years, or nearly 10 years, and it ran out in July 1914. But until then, he was jolly successful, I think.
And until 2 days before the war, he would never have got the cabinet
No.
to agree to send a clear message to Germany.
No.
Totally politically impossible.
Well, remember also that, you know, our hero again, Lord George, stood in the House of Commons on the 24th of July. It says, peace has never been as assured as it is now.
John.
Well, first, a quick one on the Labour Party. The simple, straightforward answer is the reason why Haldane went into the Labour Party was because at that stage he believed that they believed in education much more than the Liberals. It was that single issue, but obviously around that was the sense that by then he'd become estranged from Asquith, was concentrating much more on frivolous matters. That the depth of the relationship Haldane had with Asquith, going back to the early stages of their time together, which could not have been more intimate, but very, very close. It had moved apart, and Asquith was becoming very much someone that was on the social scene, so to speak. And so when Asquith just was not prepared to run with the education ticket, Haldane said, I'm going to move over to the Labour Party. And I think that to bring the strength of a really good Liberal into that government, to give the solidity to it, was a very reassuring thing for the nation. But he carried on with the policies he carried on before, which was, and there were some strong Labour policies in there. He wanted the Liberals to embrace more of Labour, they might move more quickly. I can't help you on the peace talks. I think that's the most fascinating thing, that to my embarrassment, I'm not a historian, but I spent years trying to, when I had the time for my company to start to go through the archives. I didn't come across that debate at all, to my embarrassment.
And I did actually think he was involved in that, not really.
Okay.
Haldane, I think, would have been very scrupulous not to get involved. It's the unscrupulous people like Lord George, when he is Prime Minister, he is having all the peace talks with the Austrians that he then denies later. his Great Peace Commission is 1912.
Yeah, absolutely.
February or March 1912.
That was the stick that was used to beat him up.
Yeah.
Because it was the liberal.
And the spiritual home is, my spiritual home is Germany.
Yeah.
That's
And well, his spiritual home was the classroom of Lurtz, and this was most brilliantly turned against him by the German Professor Onken, to whom he said that over a dinner party, who wrote a letter. I think it was the Times hated Haldane, saying that this is what Haldane had said, that Germans were my spiritual home. It wasn't. He'd said to Professor Onken that the classroom of Lurtz is my spiritual home.
Not the first time a politician's words might have been used slightly out of context. We've now got 3 questions from the virtual room.
Yeah, thanks very much. So first question from Andrew Weston to both speakers, basically about why were they involved in the Relugus Compact, since both of them clearly had quite a radical background and set of beliefs. What was it that they objected to about Campbell-Bannerman becoming Prime Minister? And that's about both of them. Shall we
do 3 together?
Yeah. Second question is from Andy Ellis. Grey and Haldane were both central to the policy response to the change in the European balance of power and its implementation. Was the accompanying level of secrecy inevitable, and was it justified? And third question, something we just touched on from Paul Tyler, was the Conservative insistence on removing Haldane from the government in 1915 just obsession with his alleged sympathy for Germany, or something else? And Graham Peters had a similar question, or a related question. Do you think that Asquith's failure to defend Haldane against the Unionist attacks contributed to Asquith's own ultimate downfall?
Lots there. Right, who wants to have a go?
Lots there. Relugus. And I stand to be corrected by you, but there was a deep-seated, and I think in the end quite unfair suspicion of Campbell-Bannerman. They didn't trust him to keep what they considered to be the faddists in the party under control. And likewise, at Buckingham Palace, there were concerns about Campbell-Bannerman's soundness on foreign policy. Now, Campbell-Bannerman actually played this brilliantly because he met the king in Marienbad, where they both took the waters. Campbell-Bannerman spoke a very racy kind of Viennese German, so it was brilliant in Marienbad society. But he put the king's fears about his solidity on foreign affairs to rest. He said, I'm fully committed to the Anglo-French Entente and I'm in favor of continuity in foreign policy. It's very important. But Grey and Haldane and Asquith didn't quite believe that. But it's also all that radical Gladstonian baggage that especially Campbell-Bannerman carried with him that caused them concerns. They wanted to have a more centrist, reformist, liberal administration rather than one that goes off on a home rule for Ireland kind of crusade again, and then everything goes pear-shaped very quickly afterwards. That was their one great fear, that they couldn't trust him. So I think that's part of the conspiracy. The reasons for the conspiracy, I mean, it doesn't really come off in the end. Asquith is bought off very quickly, and then the other two sort of, very nearly failed to get anything. And I think in the end, and Grey actually admitted this in 1907, he'd been very unfair to Campbell-Bannerman. Campbell-Bannerman was just the right man, because he had enough credibility with the, if you like, the far left of the party, the faddists, but he was just about acceptable to the Liberal League and the Liberal Imperialists, so if you like, the more centrist part of the Liberal Party. And I'm not sure, quite honestly, whether Asquith would have kept the show on the road if he had become party leader, even in all but name, in 1905.
I can just add to on that particular one. And Haldane, I think, like Grey, came to see that it was a mistake that they'd made in wanting to insist as they did on those 3 positions. But the fantastic silver lining, they were right. Campbell hadn't got the energy, he was dying, and of course he was dead within 2 years. But I think it was still a marvelous golden lining to it all, that as a result of not getting what they wanted, Haldane got the War Office, and the whole history of Europe changed the result of that.
No, I think that's very true. That's very true. Well, he very nearly didn't get it, of course. Yes. About the secrecy, I think there's a great deal of myth making about that by some Liberal cabinet ministers like John Morley in 1911. The point to remember is that the Prime Minister was involved, that's Campbell-Bannerman, in early 1900s, February 1906, when Campbell, the French ambassador, comes and asks for assurances and tells them that the French military attaché and the British War Office have been having exchanges about what one might do in the event of a continental war, i.e. a German attack on France. And Grey and Campbell-Bannerman discussed this, and they came to the view that the talks should continue, but that they were not binding. And I think this is one aspect that's important. It was not binding. Secondly, we didn't know what the French were planning, and they weren't going to tell us what they were going to do in the event of a war unless we gave them some sort of assurances. So it's a way of managing a potentially quite fraught relationship. And it was all about assurances, about giving the French enough assurance to resist German pressure, not giving in to German pressure, but also not so much assurance that the French cocked a snook at the Germans and goaded them into an act of aggression, which would then force the British to come in. So that's one thing. The other thing is more cabinet ministers knew about this in 1906 than they later were prepared to admit in 1911, and that has more to do with the struggles between the so-called economists and the navalists about the naval budget and the naval estimates in 1911. Of course, Campbell-Bannerman by then was dead, and Grey and Asquith said, yeah, well, you know, you kind of knew, but maybe we should have been a bit more open about it. They didn't fight this very hard because they wanted to get naval estimates through. But a lot more people knew about this than they later admitted.
Two other things, I think, on the policy, the balance of power, the secrecy justified. That's one more your side of things than mine.
Well, I don't think there was any great secrecy about British diplomacy. In those crises that occurred, Grey gave assurances to the French and promised them diplomatic support, which was what Britain was committed to give under the Entente Agreement of 1904. But he always made sure that the French were not given too much assurance so that they didn't provoke Germany into an act of aggression. At the same time, he told the Germans in 1906 and again in 1908, during the Bosnian crisis and then the second Moroccan crisis in 1911, I cannot guarantee that Britain will stay out of a war if you provoke one and don't ignore the force of public opinion. Now, that's of course something politicians will always hide behind, but in this case, it was actually a very effective instrument. It was enough to deter the Germans from running the risk of further escalation of these earlier crises, and in the end, they pulled back. So, in a sense, Grey actually achieved what he set out to achieve. He preserved peace at minimum expense. And what else could he do? We didn't have a standing army, and the country would never have accepted binding alliances in peacetime. So he had to make do with these half promises and half threats and so on. It's crucial also to understand that throughout this entire period, he always said to the Germans, we only have this deal with the French because we used to be imperial rivals. We settled our outstanding disputes and now we're friends. We have no quarrels with Germany, but there's just the naval question. We can settle that too, and things can improve thereafter. That's very much the carrot also that Haldane took with him to Berlin in 1912. And very nearly the Germans accepted it. The problem always was that the British quite rightly read the German budget, and they saw that Germany was running out of money, because Germany couldn't spend money on the army against France and Russia and on the navy against Britain. And the Germans had a very antiquated tax system, and they couldn't raise more taxes because that involved the powers of the federal states in Germany. So they were running up against the potential of a constitutional crisis in Germany. The British knew all of this. He said, we'll just lay on a few more ships and then the Germans will have to make concessions. In 1912, Bethmann Hollweg, the German Chancellor, says, it's right, we can't carry on. We will make concessions and the naval race is over. By 1930, they stopped building ships and they put all their money into the army. So it's actually worked. British policy has worked. And in 1914, in fact, Edward Grey is contemplating exploring the possibility of the further improved relations with Germany. He wants to send his private secretary to Germany. He's half German, he was educated in Germany. And his uncle, by marriage, just happens to be a former German ambassador to Paris and Constantinople. And so this is all cloak and dagger story, but he's supposed to go to Germany in July 1914 to meet the German foreign secretary to explore ways in which Germany and Britain can sort out their current problems and improve relations. This comes against the background of strained relations with France and increasingly fraught relations with Russia. And it's perfectly clear to Grey and his advisors that in 1915, when the Anglo-Russian Imperial Convention on Central Asia is got to be renewed, it's not going to be renewed because the Russians are strong, they will ask for much more than we can possibly give them. And that will be the end of the Anglo-Russian Convention, and it will have implications for relations with France. So the tantalizing prospect is, and Grey, I think, understood this in 1914, by 1950, the European landscape will be completely different. There will be a resurgent Franco-Russian alliance, a much weaker Germany, because her principal ally, Austria-Hungary, is seriously weakened and debilitated, and Italy is totally unreliable for the Germans. So, in fact, the situation is quite different, and that may mean that there are possibilities of improving relations with Germany and actually pursuing a much more traditional policy of aloofness and holding off closer continental involvement.
And your last question, I think, was on the Conservative attack on Haldane in 1915, and that was Asquith right to give in to them. I just don't know. It's a tragedy that he did give in, that you want to go back to the roots of the dissent on the Conservative benches that goes back to the Lords Lieutenant and indeed to the King. Here was Haldane when he was reforming the army, which was almost a sacrosanct body. It had the militia, the yeomanry, that the Lords Lieutenant had a vested interest in so many of these battalions and organizations. They wanted pink stripes down the trousers, epaulets on the shoulders. All of this was really torn up by Haldane and reconstructed. And so the King called all the Lords Lieutenant to Buckingham Palace and gave them effective instructions saying, you know where your duty lies. If you don't want to support Haldane and the Territorial Army, I resign as my Lord Lieutenant. So every single one pledged to give the King's support. I started my career at Rothschild's, and there's a fabulous archive on the relationship between Lord Rothschild, where you can dig into the relationship between Lord Rothschild and Haldane. Haldane was intimate with Lord Rothschild. Rothschild comes to that meeting, pledges support to the King. That very weekend, he's back in Buckinghamshire, dealing with his volunteers and telling them they should stand out for the independence again. He'd got so many of the Conservatives on the wrong side that inevitably the Conservative press, when they had their chance to bite back, took it. And what terrible consequences. And the cleverest man in government, the man that really understood the German mind better than so many others, removed from office at the time when brains were needed more than anything else. And of course, by being thrown out then, he couldn't come back for the peace. And so the peace was a much more vitriolic, nasty settlement than Haldane would ever have allowed if he'd have to play some part in it.
And would you agree with any responsibility of Asquith's fall to be linked to that?
I believe Asquith was weak. Grey would have stood with Haldane on that if he possibly could, and if he would have stood down, he said he'd stand down, but he offered, but it was just not in the national interest. And similar with Haldane, Haldane said, it is not in the national interest that I should be the cause of the debate. I will go and go quietly, and he went quietly. He never made any public comments about it. He was quite extraordinary. And indeed, just a few weeks after he'd gone, in this very building, the whole of the Liberal Party came to give a great dinner in honour of Haldane, and the wonderful illuminated manuscript testimonial given to them Haldane that night sits in the National Archive in Edinburgh again.
And just very briefly, don't forget that Asquith, but also my old friend Lord George, were absolutely petrified of Northcliffe and the Northcliffe Press, the Daily Mail, and so on, and that also played a very significant role in this.
All very modern themes. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to say, and it's partly my fault, we've been here for 90 minutes and half an hour over. Many of you have been here for the whole of the AGM before, and so I'm going to draw the meeting to a close. But I am sure that if our speakers are hanging around, they'd be very happy to take a few sort of supplementary.
Just make a statement on behalf of the club. It's not
Oh, of course, by all means.
John Campbell particularly would appreciate this. So Stuart Evington, who sits at the back of the room, and myself are determined to raise a fund to have a proper oil painting or full game.
That's wonderful.
That would
End by saying I had so many parallels, I think, between then and now, and also it struck me as a complete. I wonder how I wrote down. I wonder how well both of them would have done in today's febrile politics. As you say, you know, principled men who, when they realized that the best thing to do would be to stop distracting, you know, offer to, I mean, goodness me, boy, do we live in different times. But thank you both. It was incredibly instructive. I'm so pleased to have been able to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Liberal History Group, and I hope you all have safe and warm journeys back. Thank you very much.